Welcome to Off Script. Tune in every week to hear the stories of and insights from NPs. We're your hosts, Maxine and Danielle, two technologists who are passionate about the future of patient care.
Our guest today is Hannah Lowe, a family nurse practitioner, registered dietitian, and technologist. Hannah has been a nurse practitioner for the past 10 years and has worked across diverse settings, including a health system, a retail health clinic, a private primary care practice, and most recently, a health technology company. Hannah has experience in clinical practice, operations, and clinician education and training. In today's conversation, we discuss Hannah's unique career path, her experience as a clinician leader in health technology, and her advice for nurse practitioners considering a similar path. Hannah, thank you so much for joining us. Could you please give us your own brief intro?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. So you did a great job. I will also add I'm a mom of one and a spouse. So aspiring gardener and bibliophile, constantly reading and wanting to learn to be a stronger clinical leader. And I'm so grateful to be here with you all today.
Well, thank you so much for coming on, and we're so excited to get into a bunch of different topics with you today. So, maybe to start, we want to hear more about some of the pivotal points in your career. And you've had a really diverse career so far across both clinical work and technology. So, to frame it up for listeners, could you tell us a bit more about your career path and some of the different roles or educational experiences you've had?
Absolutely. And I'm very transparent that I'm a lifelong learner. So stay tuned. Who knows what's ahead? But first of all, I went to undergrad really exploring the opportunity to be a home economics teacher. And I think that's somewhat humorous now because things have turned out incredibly differently. So, as you all shared in my introduction, I am a registered dietitian. I studied in undergrad nutrition, which was heavy in biochemistry. And I also had a minor in hotel, restaurant, and tourism, which I often will say has linked in really well. And I studied at the University of Tennessee for undergrad. And I really wanted to, as one of the people who helped me in my training, say, spread my wings. So I immediately moved to Dallas, Texas, and did a dietetic internship. Things have really changed in the dietitian realm. So dietetic internships are typically more included in your undergrad experience or your master's program. But at that time, I had a bachelor's in nutrition, moved to Texas, completed basically a 12-month internship, very slightly unpaid. I mean, I got a small stipend, but I was exposed to all kinds of things. Parkland Hospital was excellent. I was at a hospital known for hospitality and really good press gainy scores. Kind of makes us all cringe, but it's true. And I practiced for a couple of years as a dietitian. And I often will admit, like, I have struggled with obesity my whole life. So I was never that get on the news dietitian, eat more almonds. There's nothing wrong with that. It's a beautiful career. I was always the biochem person working on nutrition support, TPN, the things that really no one wants their family to be on, but often an emergency beckons that or a life changing need. So I loved that. But I dug into clinical so deeply and worked with a really outstanding intensivist in one of my early dietitian jobs and his nurse practitioner or the nurse practitioner that worked with him. And I was like, there's something more here. So really started exploring. For me, the next step was because I wanted to place feeding tubes and I wanted to write orders. And at that time, it was very limited. So I opted to go to Vanderbilt University for their direct entry NP program, which was awesome. And then that kind of set me on this trajectory of being a dual NP RD. And since then, it's been a winding road and I've loved it. I've tried to ensure that both careers had their own voice and own place because there's a lot of misunderstanding between nutrition and the medical field. We see it all the time. And from there, I've done a little bit of everything. I'll do a quick deal that I did do student loan repayment. I was a Nurse Corps loan recipient and worked 3 years in a federally qualified health center. And I'm a really big believer in that. It was amazing. And as you mentioned, I've done some private practice. I did retail health, which was so enlightening and really set me up to me for my work now in startup. And I've also done some private consulting that I don't often advertise, but it also was very fundamental. So I think people often envision, and I've had a few people say, you've not been in a job long term. You've not sat at a hospital for 10 years. I haven't. And that's tough. But some changes have really helped me evolve into who I am when I didn't always fit a traditional mold.
It's such a beautiful and interesting career path, and the way that you've been able to pull in all of the various elements of your education, your training is really inspiring. So thank you for sharing that. You mentioned that retail health was enlightening for you and in many ways set you up for your role in health tech. Can you speak a bit more to that?
Sure. And I will always be grateful to Minute Clinic. So, retail health, I actually shadowed and I was like, oh, I won't do this. That was in school. They sit in a box all day. And retail health taught me so many things because not only were you the face of the clinic, I love a challenge and I love metrics, which is awesome in leadership and can be really tough to translate sometimes. So, retail health was all about how do we provide an excellent experience. And often I was on a major highway. And so people were stopping to see me. They also asked us to do our own marketing. So spent a lot of time in the slow season in the summer marketing. So I was able to go to a local mushroom factory and have them agree to use Minute Clinic on their insurance plan. And that was my first sales. Like no one asked me. I just thought that was a good idea. And I knew this particular mushroom factory had a large amount of underserved families that might not have the ability to get urgent care or any kind of care outside of traditional 8 to 5 brick and mortar. And I think it also taught me some responsibility. I mean, I went from a clinic where I was billing 99214, 99215 to like, oh, I have to kind of go out, get the thing, do the right thing with it, clean it up, and mark it again the next day. And in startup, much of your life is not that someone brings you the patient, you see them, you diagnose them, and you bill. It's how do we do the next right thing for people? And I think that's where retail health was really foundational for me.
That makes a lot of sense. And it sounds like it was helpful in terms of both the care planning side of things, but also getting yourself out there and marketing a bit more, which was surprising to me. I didn't realize that was part of the job with retail health. I'm wondering, it seems like for a lot of clinicians, this concept of marketing yourself is kind of foreign. How did you get comfortable with that piece, and how did that feel for you in the beginning?
So I think you're spot on because one thing you'll read, especially if you go to the deep, what as I call it, bowels of social media, is people are like, I'm not going to take out the trash and I'm not going to find my own patients. I get it. That is part of retail health. So some of it I think is personality dependent. I was never the kid who liked fundraisers, and I'll tell you, I'm the parent who's much more apt to send a check or put the elbow grease in than ask a bunch of people. But there was something about understanding the way this leader, Carrie, kind of gave us this opportunity. It was empowering. And so we kind of knew like Carrie's expectation is that we will go market. And so it sort of, she gave ideas, and then there were like best practices, which is something I loved also about retail health. They really try to bring people in and give you ideas. And so I started small. Like I would call the local middle school and say, hey, we're doing sports physicals. Here's the cash price. Please come. So it wasn't like I woke up one day and thought we're going to conquer the world, but I liked the challenge. And so I think it's about the leader setting the expectation, honestly, and then what's the follow through and what's the support. Because I don't think it's always, people are kind of shocked that you get asked to do that. And I think you kind of have to give people tips because most people don't wake up thinking, I mean, a lot of them went to business school if they're going to go market, like, and that's awesome. So it is a challenge. And I think the key part was I felt supported. I liked the accountability. I knew I was going to be asked, what did you do about marketing? And I liked that there were best practices. And so it didn't make it that I had to go to the mushroom factory the first day, but those small steps led to confidence that ultimately won that contract back.
I appreciate you kind of explaining the things that made it feel like it was possible for you, and very much hear you in the sense that if that's not a skill set you're taught, approaching it can feel scary or overwhelming without some sort of scaffolds or best practices. Once you started to get more comfortable and the marketing became a motion that you were more comfortable with along with your clinical work, how did you think about kind of transitioning your brain space between the clinical work and the marketing work? And we'll get into this a lot with given how many things that you combine.
I think that's a really good point because I do think there are certain, and I am not a nurse's eat their young. I am not a physician eat their young, sort of not speaking for their profession. I'm really not into hazing or meanness. But I do think you have to have some kind of clinical acumen to feel confident that you're like, oh, this is an otitis externa, or I did hear this abnormal heart sound. Like, what are we going to do before you even start layering things on? I mean, I think that's part of it is there's got to be some clinical competence because when that you feel confident with time, because it's a lot to think through. I mean, that's the gift of retail, right? When I worked in federally qualified health, I did a lot of refugee care. And so when you have someone coming with a really rare like thalassemia, I mean, you don't have time to think, how am I going to market that we're doing sports physicals? So some of it's the scope. Now, I will say respectfully, retail health is expanding because it does do some important work, offer extended hours that traditional brick and mortars have not quite figured out yet, or traditional practices. But I think it is, I mean, some of it is also like you're aware. I'll be honest, in retail health, you're aware of your metrics. And you, like, there were times that clinics were closing, not an hour the region I was in, but you knew, like, oh, that one closed. So you kind of have incentive to figure out how to switch brains. And then you were asked to do it kind of on non-clinic time. So you would be compensated, but you weren't trying to see the otavis externas and figure that out. So it is a switch, but I would say there had to be a certain familiarity. And for me, launching from a very critically ill, underserved, underrepresented population of like 30 patients a day to suddenly we needed to do 50 flu shots a week, there was emotional and personal capacity to switch gears. And there was also, like I said, good accountability, which I've taken with me since.
That makes a lot of sense. It sounds like they did a really good job of putting the right structures in place in terms of time separation and also emotional support to make sure that type of transition was possible and seamless. You also mentioned that there was quite tactical support too in terms of imparting best practices. Wondering if there's more that you could share in terms of best practices that were taught to you or that you learned through experience in terms of marketing yourself and your practice.
I think it's a great question. And I think that's one of the things I wish we call them clinical pearls in clinic, but we don't talk a lot about some of the resiliency or some of those things, to your point, that lead to burnout, which sometimes additional administrative opportunities can. So if I'm thinking correctly about, basically a lot of people have toolkits, especially in larger clinics. And I will tell you, I replicated this. I worked for an on-site employer in a PRN role and was a regional traveler at some, just pre-pandemic and in the pandemic. And basically they have some clinical expert who will build this out, and then it's shared often on a drive. It's often the steps. So it'll say, have you marketed? Have you thought about introducing yourself to X? Do you know your store manager? Do you know the site manager? So I was at an AT&T health clinic, which was fabulous. It was hundreds of people, often sedentary, things like that, outside of retail. So kind of getting back to the main thing here, I think that strong organizations and even like knowledge centers outside of strong organizations will do these tactical things and help you ask the right questions, because not everyone's an introvert, not everyone's an extrovert. And how do you balance that? And then how do you feel confident in what you're offering? And I think, again, it is baby steps. And then it's those toolkits of, hey, here's your challenge. How are we celebrating those challenges? And then the other thing I loved that Retail Health did was, as they were building more toward hubs, which several people are working on now to expand their service line, they had experts. So you could also call people and just say, hey, I've got these best practices documented. Do you have any other ideas? And then nationally, they would share that. And I found that to be really awesome. And I thought, when you leave this sort of sacred space, because retail health has its disadvantages, what do you take away? And then in many instances, how do you network past that? And so I've loved being a part of smaller networks to say, have you considered this as you're opening your own practice or as you're really trying to get something up and running? So I think the best practices are great, especially in these organizations that have that expectation of you, but then being able to give back and spread that after you leave is also really helpful.
Totally, yeah. Having the organizational structure and having those best practices shared, even if it's something as simple as a Google Drive, it seems makes a really big difference in terms of knowing where to get started. You mentioned that a big thread throughout your career has been looking for challenges, and we know that your most recent challenge was in the world of health technology. Could you share a bit more about the day-to-day of working in health technology and what that actually looks like?
I will sum it up and then I'll expand. But people used to say, so I joined a health tech startup 3.5 years ago. I had a 3-month-old, read every article on why young mothers should not join startups. I'm working to dispel the myth because I think it's really important to know how great that can be. But I think people will often say, we're building the plane while flying it. And I'm like, well, that's terrifying. Like, I'm not a great flyer anyway, but this is also special. But that's one of the best representations of what you're doing. And either that wakes you up with a thrill and you're pumped, or you like want to hide in the corner. And that's okay. I want to acknowledge that sometimes some of the greatest lessons we learn are from when we learn something's not for us. It's a hard lesson, but it's true. So I'll just give you a quick narrative of kind of what happened in my last startup. And that is that we brought a product from Asia essentially to the US. And so everything was from the early stages of like, how do we think about this from the US consumer standpoint to how do we translate this clinically? How are we going to integrate into health systems and health providers? I mean, it was fabulous because it was end to end. No one was saying you'll see 15 colds a day and 15 diabetes per day. This was very much a start to finish build. And I think that went from meeting some absolutely fabulous people in the space to working to take excellent care of patients as companies trusted us, to how do we work together best with our product and engineering partners to translate the clinical need, but also understand where they're coming from. So it was, you ate a serious bowl of cereal every morning of all kinds of things. And I find that thrilling. I think that some people that does promote fatigue. So I also think it's about career placement. Do you like doing the same thing every day? That is beautiful. There's nothing wrong with that. That is the backbone of society. Or do you need constant change? Are you somewhere in the middle? And I think you often have to learn that about yourself. And health tech is a great place where you learn that. I personally learned I like early stage in many ways. Like I think there's great advantage to later stage and building and great excitement there. And as my leadership coach once said, he's like, where do you fit? Are you a fixer? Are you a builder? So I would say that all of that, what may feel like controlled chaos and uncontrolled chaos, does also lead you to do a lot of introspection, which is key to me in your clinical career. And I think that's the thing I found about health tech. I do think it can be different at different stages and different funding stages and different expectation stages, but it is without a doubt some of the best feedback I heard was everything is always changing, and that it's really important to acknowledge that. And in interviews, when I was hiring, I would often say, tell me about your ability to, how do you feel about change? How have you handled it in the past? It's really, really important to acknowledge that.
That summary of your experience resonates so deeply. And each of us have gone earlier and earlier and earlier stage, and totally agree it's a personality type. And loved your analogy of it's like eating a big bowl of cereal every morning of a huge variety of things. That really feels true. I would love to hear a little bit about what the change looked like in your career specifically. So you came in, your job role was X, and now your job role, or throughout the 3.5 years, your job role transitioned. How'd that look?
Sure. So I really came in as the first advanced practice provider hired at that organization, which was such a gift. And yes, I was the first advanced practice provider. So we learned a lot about licensing. And I was right there with our chief medical officer and medical director at that time seeing patients because we were learning, bringing a product from another country essentially integrating into the health system was its own thing. So a lot of shared learnings and very much that, oh, have we ordered labs? Have we done this? Have we done that? I will also say I loved training. So while we were building the patient base, I did a lot of work with, at that time, our person who was directing training and how do we teach the whole company about chronic illness? How do we teach them about the relationship of hypertension and diabetes? So while there was like the title, part of my love was building, how do we present to a health plan? How do we think about things from we just all left, a lot of us had just left primary care to come to this company. How do we think about how primary care will interact with us? So the title wise, I was an NP for probably, I don't know, 18 months or so at least. And then I think I was the training lead for a while, which I loved because I met all the new people, but I was still taking call. I was still seeing patients. And then I became one of the lead advanced practice providers and had direct reports. And we were starting to look at regionalizing. And then eventually I became the director of advanced practice, hiring, mentoring, a few folks leading under me at that time. And so it was really a progression. But I think the thing that was interesting that I learned was often you're really doing a lot of things, not just that title, at least in this organization. I think many earlier stage or new to the US companies, that's probably not uncommon. But I loved that. I was never, I will only do clinical care. Part of my joy was in the opportunities and the networking and the meeting other people and the providing great patient care. That's what got me out of bed in the morning. But it was a progression. And you see that commonly, I think, especially in providers who have kind of left the traditional spaces, figuring out, do I want to stay clinical, which is beautiful and wonderful, or do I enjoy building scope of practice and helping understand the telehealth laws was another really big part of my unofficial work that I did officially at times. And so it was a potpourri.
That makes sense. It sounds like You were a leader from day one, and there was a lot of value that came from you getting in on the ground floor and being able to really build a lot of these structures and systems. At the same time, it sounds like there were some pretty clear transition points where your role evolved. And I'm wondering, what were some of those key transition points and how did you navigate the transition, whether that be becoming a manager of direct reports or whatever it might be? What were those transitions and how did you navigate them?
Sure. And I think that's a great point. And I think there's something to this balance, to be honest, of I'm kind of showing up as a leader. I have deep care and respect for my colleagues, even if I don't have a title that fully supports that yet, versus really advocating, like, hey, here's what I'm doing. So I would say a few things. One is transitions are such a part of startup. They're really such a part of clinic. They're just not as obvious. Sometimes they don't happen as much. Private practice is like a pond. Startup is like the ocean, or perhaps the North Shore when you're surfing in Hawaii. But I would say how you show up every day, regardless of your title, is so important. And then I sought a lot of advice, to be honest. A lot of people talk about an advisement council, and you have to build that. No one comes to you and says, I can't wait to be on your advisement council. But you kind of naturally need folks as you transition, because one part of the conversation that was always happening, which I deeply respected from my leadership, was we're going to promote you to X at this time. Like, we really believe you put in the work. You show us you can do it, we promote you. And there are many different schools of thought around that, but that was very clear to me that I knew what I needed to do to achieve. And then when the transition was coming up, often I was brought in and we would have a conversation. This is what I expect of you, this is how it will be done. And I think in yourself, you have to acknowledge, okay, I am a leader, regardless of my title. I want to show up this way every day. And this is how I'm going to show up. And then when transitions were happening, I would often try to understand what's the goal? How do I succeed? What's success look like in the person I'm reporting to, and the org structure wise? How does that look? And then as the transition would come up, I did engage in leadership coaching. I've mentioned that a little bit. I firmly believe in that. It was personally paid for. It was not a benefit to me, but it would help because I think sometimes things we need to learn about ourselves, we can't always see. And that's a direct mirror. And for better or worse, you learn a lot. And then in prep for those, I think a lot of it takes humility to also, I'm not a big fan of landing and expanding. I think you have to kind of be a sponge to instigate good change. And sometimes that fails and sometimes it flies, but that's my personal philosophy. So I think transitions would require a lot of thought around how you want to show up and how you've been showing up. And then really the collaboration to understand what success looks like by your superiors and by your company. It's not perfect and it is not linear. And I think a lot of grace and, to be honest, when the transitions come, also reminding yourself of internally who you are and your internal values, because you will fail. Failure is a part of life. And I think sometimes we're so worried about doing the next right thing that when something flops or doesn't feel good, we have to ground ourselves in who we are. And I think that gets lost in these professional advancements or transitions.
Thank you for sharing that. I very much agree that there's more at stake personally, the more that you get into something from a leadership perspective. And so it ends up that work becomes very personal because you actually have to do a lot of self-reflection in order to show up in the way that your job is asking for, it sounds like. Are there certain things on the personal side that you really had to kind of change the way you were thinking about in order to show up professionally? Or do you feel like that was just a natural part of the transition?
I'm a natural like workaholic. So I think I call it like BC before child and AC after child. And same with my husband. I mean, I think he deserves attention as well. So a lot of it was understanding some leadership principles of like, how am I going to show up? And that's part of leadership coaching, was kind of basically all of your life, because it's easy in the web of success for everything to fall to the wayside, especially when you love something, right? Not that you don't love your child or your husband, but you see success and you're all building this plane and it's finally flying. And I think you have to kind of ground yourself again in values. Like, how do I show up best at work? So is that having accountability with my boss and our one-on-ones to say, this is what's due next week? Is that taking intentional time away? Like, I think it's pretty webbed, honestly. And then I also think it's the devil's vortex where you kind of start out your week and you say, here's our 3 top priorities and here's where we can't go. And I think growing that muscle is key to sanity as well, because there will never be enough hours in the day for everything and everyone. Defining the boundaries of like, we're having dinner, like 4:30 to 7:30 is sacred time. and then figuring out how you guys show up and I get my accountable work done and the things I enjoy. It's a lot of balance. And I think that's the thing, right? Work life sway versus like work life balance was one of the key things. So it's kind of a long answer to your question, but I think a lot of recommitment. I do think taking some time away and then also kind of doing periodic check ins with both the person you report to and even the people that report to you to say, what's not going well, what is going well, and how can we course correct? And then taking true time away is so key to reevaluate all of that, I think.
Absolutely. The personal input of reflecting, how am I doing? How am I showing up relative to the things that I want to accomplish or the things that I want to embody? And then also seeking feedback from trusted individuals above you, aside you, beneath you. Those are all really good methods. Do you have examples of some common misconceptions about non patient facing roles in healthcare leadership that you think are worth dispelling?
There seems to be like a there's a couple of myths / maybe some truths in how I think you solve them. I think there is still a very multidimensional thing going on, right? Because often healers, clinical people are like, we're just here to save the world. And we are. We're here to help people and solve all their problems. And this can be very complex. There's often a perception of a non-clinical role, the clock ticking. How much more time are you going to take? How much more money is this going to take? And I think that there's honestly looking at best intent is one of the things, right? Because no one wakes up in the morning saying, I can't wait to make your life difficult and under budget to make sure that you can't have what you need. And I think that there can be a lot of they don't care, they're not looking, they don't understand. And often there's this internal conflict going on. There's the clinical, we know what they need. There's the business need. How do we marry the two? And that is not overnight. And in fact, it's incredibly dynamic. So I think one thing I personally have humbly admitted, and I have talked to finance colleagues about this before, is I often had a very polarized view of, oh, finance just wants to make it this way and we want to make it this way. Often they're weighing the really tough challenges. I mean, that's right. That's part of running the business. So I think one of the myths is that everyone's like eating bonbons. And often there are tears and there is anxiety and there are nights you don't sleep because you're trying to figure out how to keep everything balanced and keep people happy and make patients happy and do the right thing. So that's one thing, is that I do think there's a lot more caring that goes on in leadership than people can know, because I think you have to care about people to be able to be a leader. And the other myth is I think there's misunderstanding on both sides of the aisle, right? This sounds like a bipartisan discussion, but there's like, I think sometimes the business side thinks, well, they just care too much about their patients and they just want to spend more time. And it's not because clinical people are lazy. They often really went into this to help people, but they did not have a lot of training in business about time and minutes and COGS and all the other fun acronyms that you try to figure out on a P&L and everything else. And then I think, again, I've been inspired by the amount of people I've met who are like, I didn't choose to be a clinical clinician, but I care about healthcare and I want to solve it. And I think sometimes on the clinical hat, we can be like, oh, we're the only ones who know. And I think those attitudes can be dangerous too. So I think there's a need for more collaboration because the myths feel strong. And when something goes wrong, or the toilet paper's one ply, or whatever you want to say in the hospital, or the food's terrible, like whatever, there's often a deeper reason, assuming best intent. And I think in healthcare, that's lost very often.
That's so thoughtfully articulated. And I think that last sentence in particular sums it up really well, of assuming best intent on both sides of the aisle, in the sense that clinicians want what's best for patients and what's best for the system. And often those on the business, leadership, finance, whatever it might be side want the exact same things, but how they actually think through those questions might be a bit different. And so it seems like a really good lesson of just always assuming best intent and trying to get to a point of deeper understanding. I'm wondering if you have any myths or truths that come to mind as it relates to working in health technology versus a more traditional healthcare setting.
Well, first of all, I think of the myth of Silicon Valley, just humorously, because I think one of the deepest important things is humor, because there's so much time and agony sometimes and love of what you're doing. I think the myth that I most despise is like, oh, it's just full of people with money who are just trying to make more money on AI. I disagree. I've never met a more, now it doesn't mean it doesn't happen. I mean, I think if you have enough networking conversations, eventually you meet someone who has a brazen idea and you're like, this is unsafe for humanity and everyone, or, the opposite, gosh, this is very humanitarian. I do not know how this will fly or get funding. So I think one of the most encouraging things coming from a very jaded health system that people often don't understand is there truly is often beautiful intent behind their product. There's a personal story, there is a life-changing experience, and a founder who may not know how they're going to get to the end point just has this beautiful vision. Whereas I think sometimes in the news you see, and I get it, being busy in a primary care clinic and someone else directing the care of my patient, very upsetting. I get it. But again, I think not everyone in the startup world is just trying to solve a problem in silo healthcare. And I think if there was a little bit more camaraderie around ideas, then integration into actual day-to-day would be much easier. I also think this sort of pulling clinical people out of healthcare and better using AI seems to be really mystical. I did an AI dermatology survey yesterday for fun to see what I thought about some just common things you'd see in primary care. And I think there is this, like, again, it's almost bifurcated, like, oh, we can't let that in here, or it's going to change the world. I mean, I remember when EKG reading started to be automated, and I was very new in practice, and the EKG said Wolf, Parkinson, White. And I was like, no, I think it was having a moment. You cannot. So there is this in between. And I think there's a myth of people are coming for our jobs. Well, I don't think that's fully true, but I wish we could better partner for the tools, because I think if you look at the end game, another common one is like, is there another way we could engage people so that they're not constantly coming back into our office? Now, if you're billing fee for service, cool. I make more money if you come to my office, or I can telehealth you. Is there any use of technology that could better deploy and everyone wins? So I think there are myths of what's coming. I mean, I heard one at an educator conference not long ago, and I'm just like, I don't see this happening. Like, humans still need you. For dietitians, grocery store tours are probably not going to be done by Rosie the robot anytime soon. Like, they're not going to pick up a pack of Doritos and say 0 fiber, and you go to Blueberries and there's like, 8 grams in a cup or something. So I think that there's just misunderstanding, and I get it. When you are exhausted in clinic and you are frustrated and one more person tells you what to do and you're like, I'm the one who trained, makes sense. But again, when you have the space and honestly the luxury of assuming best intent out of not being so burned out, it really helps the myths, I think.
Totally. It goes back to your response to the last question. If both sides could see each other's point of view, there is this really amazing nexus of innovation that could be created from that. But often it feels like on both sides, people are seeing past one another or assuming that their approach is the right way to do it, when in reality, there's really a mixed requirement that's needed. That in mind, we'd love to go touch a little bit more into clinical things before we wrap up. I'm curious if you have any tips for developing clinical training protocols. And this could be either, from a more with a clinical hat on, or a more technologist hat on, or a combination hat.
So training protocols are, I think I use this a little too loosely, but they're a labor of love. So I think it depends. Like when I was in federally qualified health, I'll pivot back to health tech. Some things were really interesting. Like I ended up doing a lot of training informally without a title. Just, I loved it. Teaching was natural for me. So I would essentially develop, like someone would come to me and have questions about anemia, and I would immediately go to, there's a great Mayo Clinic's Proceedings that was an excellent teacher. So we could delve into that. So I think resourcefulness is really important. Now, health tech wise, when you're building protocols, when you're looking at how do you help people succeed, right? How do you help people feel like they know what they're doing every day? That is almost more of a fact-finding mission. So where are the bumps? What's the agenda? And then really assuming how do you best get the information to people? So there were a lot of PowerPoints, which I graduated college some time ago, like undergrad, and we're still using PowerPoint. So this is kind of problematic. So part of it is, just getting really basic. Can you use an LMS? Also knowing your audience. Like often health tech folks are curious. So sitting and lecturing at them is really not useful. Like I'm saying this out of humility. I did this to people. So really getting creative on the learning styles. And then also giving yourself grace. That's the other really tricky part. When I was in clinic or developing modules for something that was when the JNC8 came out, I'm starting to date myself. Like we were like, oh, look at the JNC8. It's new. How are we going to treat hypertension? How are we going to teach this? Whatever. That was fine. That's very finite. I would find in health tech, that sometimes you did do PowerPoints and you did do these recorded Zoom lectures because in 6 weeks, your process might change. So some of it was understanding your audience. What are your platforms or available opportunities? And also trying to remain agile. And that's very difficult when you're constantly changing. So I think those are the three basics. And the other thing I learned really the hard way in the training part was how many people are kinesthetic learners. And when you're in a 100% remote environment, how are you meeting the needs of the kinesthetic learner? And that's one I never fully conquered, but I certainly would go on and say, and one last plug, we ended up hiring a learning and development specialist, and he was incredible. He had been an elementary school teacher, so I had a lot of humble pie when he came because I had the content and the biochem or whatever. He was like, well, why don't we reposition it to best meet the needs of our learners? So some of it is also about partnership because it requires a village, and sometimes you have that resource and sometimes you don't.
That's awesome. I love that you answered the question from the perspective of an educator, which honestly surprised me a little bit. Like, it makes so much sense that a big part of clinical training protocols is how do you actually disseminate the information, and being really aware of different learning styles makes so much sense, but unexpected. So awesome. And thank you for sharing that. To close, we'll ask you the same two questions that we ask all of our guests. The first is on the healthcare system more broadly, and the second is just in terms of advice for others. What changes would you like to see in the American healthcare system to really improve patient care?
So actual changes, if I could give my dream, is a universal health record because I see so many safety problems and so much, honestly, hilarious waste from having 25 EMRs at everybody's office that don't talk to each other. So to me, that would be simple. Just put out a universal one. Not from the VA, in case you're wondering. I would love the VA, warm fuzzies, just something more up to date. I'm not going to name any of the big players, but there's plenty of great ones. We could just choose one and all get along. And the other thing I would tell you is I wish, and this is again philosophical, that we were able to further integrate throughout life some level of self-efficacy around healthcare, because I think that's where I've seen some of the most brutal, harsh side that leaves me really quiet and sad and deeply questioning many things. And so I think it's like, yes, there's a tactical, like, let's get everyone on the same EMR. Seems simple. I'll run for president next. And then there's the actual, like, how do you further empower people in their own care? And that one is deeply philosophical and beyond one tactical thing. But I think those are two aspects of things I wish that could universally change in the system.
I love both of those. I love the first one more from like a technology and data perspective. And the second one, so much of what Otto is kind of founded on is that idea of autonomy or efficacy, self-efficacy. So love that.
Yep.
Our final question before we wrap up is, what is some advice that you want everyone to hear or to walk away with?
So I would say the key cornerstone is really considering who you are and who you want to be is so important, because someone's always going to naysay out there and be like, no, you can't, you're not capable, you can't do that. And I think if I could empower people to really look deeply at what they enjoy and what they love, I think that's a really key part of success. Because yes, some people will have ability to never have to have a 9 to 5, and that's beautiful and amazing. But I think if I can empower people to believe in themselves and to try to figure that out, whether it be a spiritual awakening, whether it be a personal, like, soul searching journey, it's really important, because I think no matter what you do, if you have that ability to figure that out, it's much more life-giving than life-sucking. And I admit that exploration requires some level of privilege. And there were times in my life that I can tell you, I came out of school, master's program with a mortgage worth of debt. So I was not at the point where I would have the freedom. But as you have freedom to explore opportunities, be it you become a consultant, be you send that first LinkedIn message to somebody that does something you think is cool. I don't think it has to be this, like, I'm leaving my 9 to 5 to go to a pre-seed startup. I think you can take baby steps, but I would encourage you to itch that curiosity, because it really does. I think it's fulfilling, it's life-giving, and it's worth exploring. I mean, there's nothing wrong if you want to be at the same hospital for 30 years, but maybe you want to do informatics, or maybe you want to do more, I'm not sure, be on the formula committee at a children's hospital. There's just things that I would say, no matter if you wake up wanting a very big bowl of different cereal at breakfast or you want to have the same one every day, wherever that curiosity is, I would encourage you to scratch it. I think it can lead to great things, and it can also keep you interested, because after a while, certain things get old and you need a little challenge. And what does that look like? And I think it doesn't have to be land and expand in something new. It can also be in your own center. What can you do?
I love that advice and totally agree with the scratch your curiosity itch in any way you can do it. We have so many more questions for you that we do not have time for today, but this was such a pleasure. And thank you so much for your time today. This was awesome.
Thanks for having me, and so much congratulations to the great work that you're doing.
Thanks so much.